I thought it'd be helpful just to spend a little bit of time thinking about life beyond lockdown, as we can now look forward to restrictions being eased and getting back to meeting, and we would expect that those restrictions are going to become progressively more and more eased as we go through the summer and the rest of the year. So I'm going to be fairly kind of succinct here in going through a number of points, but then we'll have a little bit of time in groups for people maybe to chat and to pray about them. So one of the things I thought about in looking at life after lockdown was some of the global trends. It's quite easy just to rush to be quite parochial and think about how does this affect me in my particular place. But COVID has obviously been a global phenomenon and it's had some global effects, one of which is the rise of authoritarianism. We'd seen this happening pre-lockdown in places like China and Russia and Turkey, but it's very much the case that lockdown has given dramatic new powers to governments in the West. And of course, we can argue that those have been kind of necessary and essential, but there's been a level of government control in Western countries which has been normalised now by COVID. And while we expect the restrictions to be rolled back, precedents, of course, have now been set. Secondly, globally, there's been a growing nationalism. Again, this was something that was happening pre-COVID, but I think it's been accelerated by it. Competition, rivalry over vaccines, closing borders, accusations, a sense of increased economic vulnerability, and that may pan out in terms of longer-term travel restrictions and tensions. There's also, during COVID, been the advance of individual surveillance. Now, we're not Uyghurs, we don't live in China with its massive state surveillance apparatus, but COVID has definitely strengthened and accelerated trends towards things like monitoring apps, medical passports, and tracking people. Also seen a rise globally in religious extremism. There's been a trend of this in many places, but the Barnabas Fund has reported a very significant spike in attacks on Christians in places like Nigeria and India in 2020. That's been exacerbated in some places by security forces being diverted for COVID duties, but also because of scapegoating and conspiracy theories, which takes us on to the rise of conspiracy theories themselves. Fear, disruption, insecurity, of course, are breeding grounds for weird and wonderful ideas. And we know historically that plagues create apocalyptic fever. And Christians aren't immune from that. And also there's been a greater inclination by governments and big tech to silence and close down conspiracy theories, which is fine as far as it goes. But of course, the danger is that then becomes overextended and becomes quite subjective and arbitrary. And then finally, in terms of the big global picture, it's resulted in increased economic disparities. COVID has had its worst effects in the developing world, where there's not been the economic cushioning that we've had in the West. Global poverty rates are expected to rise for the first time in 20 years, and that will have an impact on mission needs and indeed things like population movement. So COVID has had big macro global effects. Now, what about coming a bit more to the home front, some of the lessons that we can learn from the last year? I think the first lesson, of course, is that God is sovereign. COVID is a huge dent to human hubris, or it should be. It's amazing to think that every COVID virus particle in the world today could be contained in a can of Coke. That's all it took to stop the world and to close our churches. As Isaiah 40 puts it, he brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. But secondly, the gospel is needed more than ever. The fragility of life has been laid bare once again, and our world really has nothing to offer beyond a few more years of the same trouble and sorrow. The mental health crisis is exposing the hollowness of our culture in so many ways. And our society is becoming increasingly pagan, harsh, and without grace in its values. We so need the gospel. Thirdly, I think we've learned that community and church community is vital. Relationships have been key to holding church families together. Those plugged in and connected with others have fared the best spiritually, generally speaking. And we've seen that especially, I think, among our young people, haven't we? Fourthly, it's taught us about the necessity of home and family discipleship. When church is closed, your children's spiritual welfare can't be contracted out. Like homeschooling, if parents don't step up, then the children will flounder. Personal faith and family spiritual care really is my responsibility. Fifthly, then, in terms of lessons, technology has been a great friend. Thank the Lord for Zoom and online banking. We've discovered fabulous new ministry resources. They have been lifelines for many people, especially those who would have been very vulnerable and isolated. And so let's think about not just retaining it, but how do we develop it smartly, ongoing to maximize even more opportunities. Sixthly, I think we've learned that pastors need to be generalists. If you're somebody whose ministry was just preparing a Sunday sermon, then that really hasn't cut it. We've had to be weekday pastors. We've had to learn about tech. We've had to resource people away from traditional church programs and facilities. Number 7, pastor ministries need to be flexible. That's been a big lesson from COVID, hasn't it? We've had to make and incorporate lots of changes. We've had to stop things and start new things. We've had to reorganize service structures and ministry programs that might have been in place for decades prior to COVID. And so let's keep some of that entrepreneurial spirit and that willingness to change going forward. We've made adjustments because we've had to for a COVID world. But what about other adjustments going forward for other changes that are happening around us in our world? And then 8thly, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but one that came to me was I think we have learned the value of good works. We are a people who are called to do good works. That's very much the theme of Titus, apart from other books. But if our churches didn't have good works going into COVID, that is, if we didn't have practical ways in which we were serving and blessing our communities, then last March, when the padlock went in the door, our church probably disappeared completely off the radar as far as our community was concerned. It's been good works that has enabled so many churches to continue to have a presence and a pathway into their communities, despite all the other restrictions. So maybe there's a lesson to learn going forward. Well, what about the future then, if those are some of the lessons? And in your groups, there'll be other lessons that you might want to chip in, and we would love to hear what those lessons are so that we can kind of build up a bigger and better picture of reflections on the last year. But going forward, the future, well, there's lots that we don't know, let's be honest. We don't know quite how long it's going to be before we get back to full normality. It's going to be staggered, it's going to be slow. We don't know who's going to come back to our churches exactly, how long it will take them to come back, and what they'll be prepared to do when they come back. But we do know, and I think we can be fairly certain, that the effects will linger. Old habits have been replaced by new ones, both good and bad. There will be new anxieties. I was hearing from a woman in our church who does CBT therapy, and they're getting lots of people now coming who are very anxious about going back to the workplace. Because if you've not enjoyed your work previously, or you didn't like your boss beforehand, the thought of going back after a year where you've been kind of sheltered from it will be quite a troubling one. And we might counterintuitively see a lot of people suddenly going off sick just at the very point they can go back to work as normal. There'll be ongoing mental health issues, and there'll be no doubt some continued economic shocks to come. So the effects are going to linger. Thirdly, erratic attendances, I think, should be expected. People are going to have to catch up on a lost year in the coming months. People will have family visits, holidays, recreational things, even paused work developments that they need to catch up on or they want to catch up on. So we shouldn't expect that church is going to be the only thing people are going to be rushing back to do with their newfound freedoms. So expect some erratic attendances. Fourthly, expect highs followed by anticlimax. I think we may well see a big spike initially in enthusiasm and even our attendances as people have the chance to get back together. But a bit like returning from a long trip abroad, you know, that first flush of kind of novelty and being back to seeing all your old friends again is quickly overtaken by real life and the old routines having to kick in again. So be prepared for people's mood to dip again in the coming months, for there even to be disillusionment, you know, in a few months' time, or negativity towards the church, people falling away even after they have come back. Fifthly, your church will be different. Quietly and imperceptibly, your church has been reconfiguring itself during lockdown. Your congregation will be different. There'll be some new people. There will be absent people. There will be exhausted people. There might be some people who have been really energized by lockdown. There will be changed people, both positively and negatively. People will use the break they've had to reconsider their involvements in a whole range of things. It will be a moment where they might want to change their ministry commitments, all of which is going to have a knock-on your church and your ministries. So sixthly, don't rush to restart everything. This is the opportunity to review. What is it that the Lord has pruned away in the last 12 months? Things that were actually good, healthy growth, but like the gardener, pruning away healthy growth in order to allow better and more vibrant and new growth to come through. What were some of the good things you did that were actually perhaps hindering better things in the past? Ray Evans, in one of our national webinars recently, talked about the fact when he went into ministry, he thought the big challenge was going to be getting people to do things. But he quickly found out that it was almost as big a challenge to get people to stop doing things. So take time to pray, to reflect, because you're not likely to get such a window as this to change and to reconsider and to start afresh in a long time. Well, very finally then, life beyond lockdown, the future. What do we know? Well, we know, and we've learnt this, that people like getting together, don't they? So think about building in lots of community, relational opportunities, and kind of just social gathering time. People need to get to know each other again in many cases. Allow for that. We also know that people like variety, don't they? One of the things that's been so flattening and difficult about lockdown is just a lack of variety. I think there's lots of levels of wisdom in which the Lord punctuated Israel's calendar with all these different festivals and things to do. So think about some variety going forward, whether that's the barbecues or the trips or the gets together or different themes in the months ahead. They need encouragement. I think this is really going to be a time to build people up, to strengthen them and to reassure them and to show them and let them know that they're loved. There will have been many failings over the last year, many shortcomings. People might feel quite guilty about having withdrawn or let things go by COVID. But remember, Paul never missed an opportunity to highlight and praise the positives in people, regardless of what other problems there might have been. And thirdly, we know that people forget quickly. That can be bad, like Israel. They forget the Lord's promises, they forget the past blessings and helps that God has given them. And so we need to remind them of that, don't we? That's what the Word of God does. But more neutrally, I think people will get into old patterns again before too long. I mean, relatively speaking, not overnight, but in the kind of months and maybe years ahead. That's human nature. So this is a real window of change, but it's also a time to resolve to remember God's faithfulness and goodness to us during the pandemic. So one just little suggestion is maybe think about having a special service later in the year. Could be a great gospel opportunity to remember the losses of COVID and the people that have been lost, but also to recognise God's goodness and point us to the ultimate and only hope that we have in Christ.